In late autumn of 1886, in the wind-whipped Frosthill Valley beneath the northern mountain range, the 8-year-old widow Martha Kellgren lived quietly atop Raven Bluff in a small cabin surrounded only by an old stand of pines. People were used to seeing her move slowly, wrapped in her late husband's old shawl, but that year she began doing something that stirred the whole valley, single-handedly building a fully enclosed shed around all four sides of the cabin, with a low roof and tightly fitted wooden frame, making it look as though she were burying the entire house inside a strange wooden box. Every morning, passers-by on the trail would see her dragging heavy timbers, setting posts, chiseling joints, and roofing rough panels with her thin but resolute hands. The smell of pine resin, the steady thud of her hammer, and her small figure stood out against the lead-gray sky of the changing season. From a distance came mocking voices. "She's gone mad, planning to live in a wooden tomb?" Some smirked and shook their heads, saying old age and loneliness had driven her senile. But despite the whispers, Martha offered no explanation, no reply, not even a glance at anyone. She simply kept her head down, placing each timber exactly where it belonged, working until nightfall, as if the entire world beyond that shed no longer concerned her. From the moment Martha started building the shed, Frosthill Valley buzzed with gossip. People gathered at the blacksmith shop, outside the tavern, along the market trail, repeating the same judgment. The shed will rot the cabin. That thick wood will block the sun, she'll freeze to death. They spoke as if it were the obvious conclusion of anyone who knew anything about northern building. Children running past each afternoon called her Burrow Widow and kept going without looking back. Nearly the whole town considered what she was doing fundamentally wrong. Wood pressed tight against the walls would trap moisture, prevent evaporation, drastically reduce daytime heat gain, and soon ruin the cabin planks. The loudest voice belonged to carpenter Henry Braddock. At the market, he declared to the crowd, "Wood has to breathe. Enclosing it like that is the same as making the house rot itself. The walls will stay damp all winter." He explained that the sun was a natural supplementary heat source for cabins, and any barrier interfered with that process. The townspeople listened and nodded, convinced Henry was right. Meanwhile, Martha answered no one. She continued measuring distances, setting posts, reinforcing each roof panel with cold precision. One afternoon, neighbor Thomas Hale, who lived half a mile away, rode up the hill. He didn't come to mock, but to warn. Standing at the edge of the shed, he said bluntly, "You're blocking the sunlight, Martha. Without sun, the cabin will lose heat faster." Then he pointed at the upright boards. "When the snow comes, you won't be able to get firewood. The wind will blow back into the passageway. You'll be trapped inside." These were practical arguments, not insults. Martha listened, set down her timber, and answered without changing expression, "I'm preparing for the wind, not the sun." Thomas fell silent. The short, clear statement felt as though she had already calculated every principle. Wind caused most heat loss, not lack of sun. Thick wood could slow heat transfer. The airspace between the two walls could maintain steadier temperatures than exposed walls. Thomas had no rebuttal. He could only look at the nearly completed shed frame and feel a vague unease, not about the structure itself, but about something that might happen this winter. By late November, the first reports from the Northern Railroad weather station began to catch some people's attention. Barometric pressure had been dropping steadily for hours, outside any normal pattern. The graph line fell straight like a knife cut, signaling a massive cold air mass moving down from Canada at unstable speed. The next morning, the sky over Frosthill Valley changed color. Not gray, not white, but a distinctive muted purple of thick, heavily compressed clouds. The wind began howling in long, even gusts that sounded like metal being stretched. By noon, every bird in the valley had vanished. There was no more wing beat or flock call. The older residents immediately recognized this was not normal. They told one another that the last time they had seen sky and wind like this was before the blizzard of 1849, a storm whose chilling stories many families still passed down about cold that snapped shovel handles and froze water in kettles in minutes. On the second afternoon, the local paper, the Frosthill Chronicle, ran a brief warning. "The Great White Tempest is forming. The Great White Tempest may sweep the area within the next few days." The bulletin said temperatures could drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, winds gusting 70-80 miles per hour, and the plunge could happen in hours, not days. Still, most of Frosthill Valley did not treat it as serious. Didn't every winter bring storms? They trusted traditional preparations. Firewood neatly stacked in the yard, windows sealed with oiled paper, and the stove kept burning would be enough. They believed generations of experience more reliable than any weather report. Passing Martha's cabin, they only shook their heads again. She's worrying too much. What storm could destroy a log house that stood for decades? No one asked why the pressure was falling so fast, why the sky had turned that unnatural color, why the birds disappeared in less than a morning. No one wondered why the oldest residents, rarely alarmed, were staring north with tense faces. Frosthill Valley carried on with daily chores. Splitting a little extra wood, checking porch roofs, gathering feed for livestock. They believed the old ways were sufficient. And they believed Martha was only tormenting herself. None of them knew that in just a few days the valley would face the fiercest blizzard in nearly half a century, a storm in which traditional preparations would completely fail. 3 years earlier, on a January night so cold that breath froze into white frost right in front of one's face, Martha's husband, Joel Kellgren, left the cabin to fetch more firewood. The wind had already shifted, signaling a sudden temperature drop, but they had no choice. The woodpile in the yard was buried under wet snow, and the dry wood inside would last only a few hours. Martha remembered clearly the sound of the door opening as Joel stepped into the dark, no complaint, just his familiar nod to reassure her that everything was still under control. But nearly an hour later, the cabin grew colder faster than she expected. She tried burning the remaining pieces, but heard only water sizzling beneath the bark, producing more smoke than flame. The stove glowed for a few minutes, then died. Martha wrapped herself in extra blankets, staring into the blackness outside the window, knowing Joel was fighting not only wind but wet snow and thin ice coating each log, making them nearly impossible to burn. When they found Joel the next morning, he lay less than 40 steps from the cabin, hands still clutching 2 useless wet logs. Martha saw something she had never imagined she would see, the absolute helplessness of the strongest man she had ever known, who had always believed determination and strength were enough to conquer a northern winter. That day, with his last breath, Joel said simply, "No one should have to go out into a storm for firewood." The short sentence carried the entire failure of living by luck and habit. After his death, Martha understood that the problem was not how much wood was stockpiled, but how to protect it from wind, snow, and moisture that stripped a log of all its value. If the wood was wet, the fire would go out. If the fire went out, people could not retain heat. And if people had to venture into the storm to salvage dry wood, they might never return. From that year on, Martha began observing the cabin, wind directions, heat loss through every plank gap. She thought about double wall construction, about creating a dead airspace between the cabin and an outer barrier. She thought about how wind stole far more heat than lack of sun. Those calculations became the foundation for enclosing the cabin in a shed in 1886, and that was why she paid no attention to the town's laughter. They had not seen Joel in the storm that night, had not held wet logs in their hands, did not understand the cost of relying on traditional ways. Martha understood, and she would not let it happen again. The blizzard struck just after midnight, without any usual warning transition. One moment Frosthill Valley was merely a chilly late autumn valley. The next, wind screamed down the mountainsides like a steel train plunging into the earth. In the first 2 hours, temperature fell from 5 degrees Fahrenheit to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, then kept dropping unchecked to 43 degrees Fahrenheit. The sudden change made the air sharp and dry, enough to crack door edges and freeze moisture in every exhaled breath of anyone outside. Wind slammed weak porches, ripping off makeshift covers. Snow whipped horizontally like sand, slipping through any crack it found. Many homes began taking in snow at ground level, even with doors barred. Window glass iced over from the inside, thick frost turning indoor firelight into a dim blur. People burned wood non-stop, doubling fuel, yet stove flames shrank instead of growing. Outside, wind sucked heat away faster than wood could replace it. Warmth vanished as soon as it formed. Many families only then realized the biggest problem was not wind or cold, but the distance from cabin to woodpile. Stacks neatly placed 30-40 feet away in the yard were now buried under knee-deep, then waist-deep snow. To go out Men tied ropes around their waists, anchoring the end to a porch post to avoid getting lost in the whiteout. They hunched over, advancing inch by inch, taking tens of minutes just to reach the pile. But when they dug through the covering snow, they discovered something worse. Every log was soaked. Melted snow had seeped into the bark, refreezing into thin ice, turning the wood heavy and cold logs that, placed in the stove, only crackled and produced thick gray smoke. Flames flared for seconds, then died, leaving the smell of steam and wet ash. In many cabins, smoke began pooling under the ceiling. Adults coughed violently, children shivered under blankets. Stoves glowed but gave no heat, making families feel as though they were trying to burn stones instead of wood. By near dawn, Frosthill Valley sank into silent chaos. Dim lamplight, wind-pounding roofs, and panicked voices stuffing more useless logs into stoves. On the eastern forest edge, one small house lost its temporary roof patch to the wind. Snow instantly poured in, covering the parlor in ice within minutes. Elsewhere, a porch post snapped, the front door flew open, and wind rushed straight inside. Every attempt to block it failed. Cloth, burlap, or boards were torn away instantly. By first light, many families retreated to a single room, burning whatever remained dry: stools, bed frames, even old wall sections. Each family could only huddle together, sharing body heat, waiting for the storm to ease. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that if the temperature kept falling, they might not survive the night. Frosthill Valley, which had trusted that traditional preparation was enough, now faced the stark truth. Against a storm like this, everything they knew was useless. In that dark night, no one thought of Martha Kellgren. No one imagined how she was faring on Raven Bluff, the place that took the strongest winds in the entire valley. In their minds, a widow living alone in an old cabin would surely be the first to perish. But the reality was the complete opposite. While the entire Frosthill Valley was battered and swaying in the gale, Martha's cabin was so quiet she could hear embers falling in the stove. There was no wind whistling through planks, no porch roof rattling under pressure. The shed she had built over 2 months performed exactly as planned. A thick wooden jacket around the cabin, creating lower pressure inside so wind could not reach the wall surfaces directly. Snow slid off the shed roof and fell at the outer edge, never touching the main cabin. As a result, the cabin foundation stayed dry, walls did not ice over, and no cold draft penetrated. Between cabin and shed was a narrow airspace only about 20 inches wide, but its value far exceeded its simple appearance. It was the natural insulation layer Martha had counted on. Still, air absorbed and retained heat, slowing outward transfer, allowing the cabin to maintain steady temperature. Any house in Frosthill Valley was burning 3 times as much wood, yet Martha's cabin stayed warm with the stove kept low. Inside that dry corridor, firewood was stacked like a wall right against the cabin surface. No snow, no moisture, no wind reached it. Every log remained as dry as the day she had placed it there. When the stove needed fuel, Martha simply stood, took 3 steps to the cabin door, unlatched it, and reached into the corridor. Logs were within arm's reach, light, dry, quick to catch. She needed no coat, no safety rope, no fight against freezing wind. Every motion was neat and safe, the complete opposite of the townspeople's desperate struggle to dig wet wood from outdoors. Inside the cabin, fire burned steadily. No crackling from moisture, no smoke pooling overhead. Heat was retained, reflecting off walls, giving the room an autumn-like warmth. Martha sat in Joel's rocking chair, opened the small wooden box where she kept his old letters. The handwriting had faded, the paper yellowed, but she still recognized the familiar strokes. She read line by line, firelight illuminating her calm face. The wind outside sounded only as a distant echo, having no effect on the warmth inside. For a brief moment, Martha whispered, almost to herself, "Winter is out there, not in this house." It was not a comforting remark, but a clear conclusion. After 3 years of observation, calculation, and remembering Joel's death, she knew the cabin's problem lay not in air temperature, but in wind force and heat loss rate. The shed addressed both. It dispersed wind force, blocked moisture, and created a buffer slowing heat transfer. The result was stability while every other house fought the storm. Outside, wind swept Raven Bluff harder than anywhere in the valley, but inside the shed, air was nearly still. Inside the cabin, temperature held steady. The whole of Frosthill Valley shivered against the blizzard, while Martha sat alone in her warm, bright room, holding an old letter, knowing her decision had been right and that Joel, had he lived, would have understood it all from the start. On the second day of the blizzard, Raven Bluff completely vanished under a thick blanket of snow. From the valley below, no trail was visible, no wooden fence, not even the outline of the cabin, everything blurred, as if the entire hill had been buried in an endless solid white mass. The wind shifted directions constantly, whipping snow horizontally across the slopes, piling it into layers in places nearly as high as a house roof. In those conditions, no one could see any sign of life on Raven Bluff. What especially convinced the whole of Frosthill Valley that Martha was dead was that no one saw smoke rising from her cabin. Every cabin in the area, whether steep-roofed or flat, continuously belched black or gray smoke throughout the storm, the only way to keep stoves going. But from the direction of Raven Bluff, there was absolutely no smoke, not thin smoke, not smoke blown away by wind, but none at all. To the people here, that could mean only one thing. Martha's stove had gone out. And when a stove died at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, no one survived long. Rumors spread quickly through the valley. At the tavern, people said her shed had collapsed under the snow weight. At the blacksmith shop, they said she was trapped in the narrow corridor, unable to get out. Some whispered that the cabin door had been ripped open by wind and cold had poured straight in. All those theories led to the same conclusion. The widow Martha Kellgren had frozen solid in her shed. In the raging storm, no one could go check, but everyone accepted it as fact. Thomas Hale was the most affected by this thought. Since the previous evening, he hadn't slept. He sat close to his fire, listening to wind batter the door, replaying their last conversation, his warning about sunlight, her reply about wind, and how she kept working even as he stood there. He wondered if he should have done more, convinced her to stop, brought her to his home before the storm, or at least done something to make her less alone. Those thoughts plunged him into inescapable guilt. He had known Martha since she and Joel first moved in. He knew Joel understood structures, wood, wind directions. He knew Martha had learned much from her husband. But facing a storm this big, he hadn't believed what she said. The winter silence outside, combined with no smoke from the cabin, made him believe he had been wrong. He had walked away instead of forcing her off the hill before it was too late. In many cabins down the valley that night, quiet prayers were offered for the widow. One family whispered for God to take her soul gently. Another set out a bowl of water and a candle, as they did for those lost in harsh winters. Many who hadn't liked her, some who had never spoken to her, still felt an inexplicable sadness. Winter always claimed someone each year, but this time everyone sensed that Martha's death, if it had happened, was something they might have prevented if they hadn't been so busy mocking her. Wind still lashed doors, temperatures remained deadly, and Raven Bluff stayed buried in silent white. No one knew Martha's cabin hadn't grown cold. No one knew her fire still burned steadily. And no one, not a single person, suspected that the next morning they would face a reality completely opposite to what they believed in that stormy night. The morning after, when the wind finally stopped, Frosthill Valley emerged in a ravaged, unrecognizable state. Snow covered every path, roof, fence. Many cabins showed only their roofs, the rest sunk in waist-deep white drifts. Trees leaned, livestock sheds had corners torn off, and the trail up Raven Bluff had vanished as if it never existed. In that heavy silence, Thomas Hale knew the task no one wanted. Go see if Martha Kellgren was alive or dead. No one said it outright, but everyone saw the trip as retrieving a body. 6 men from the valley volunteered to go with him, bringing shovels, marking sticks, and a sled pulled behind in case they had to bring a corpse down. They tied ropes around their waists, both to avoid getting lost in deep snow and to keep formation. The climb was slow. Snow reached knees, sometimes hips. Though wind had died, the fresh snow remained soft from the night storm, draining strength with every step. No one spoke. No one mentioned Martha's name. The group's silence made Thomas feel the weight in his chest even more. As they neared the hilltop, The cabin's shape still didn't appear. There was only a massive white mound stretching along the vague terrain. Only when they stood at the slope's edge did Thomas realize. Martha's entire shed was buried nearly to the roof, only the faint outline of the wooden peak protruding like the top of a giant igloo. The wind-compressed snow was very hard. Digging in required force and technique. The group started shoveling a path. Each strike made a heavy thud against the snow. They dug toward the estimated front door, based on Thomas's memory of the porch location. It took over half an hour to expose the first wooden surface. Then they kept carving through the thick snow blocking the entrance. When they cleared enough space to stand upright, Thomas stepped forward and signaled the others to pause. He brushed snow off the door surface, checked the hinges to confirm it was the cabin door, then knocked hard 3 times. The sound muffled into surrounding snow, not carrying far. No answer. He knocked again, harder, then pressed his ear to the door, listening for any movement inside. Still silence. One man in the group whispered, "If the stove went out last night, she's probably gone." Thomas didn't reply. He knocked once more, so hard his fingertips stung. Still nothing. No footsteps, no latch sliding, no furniture shifting, just complete silence. A light breeze on the slope flicked snow onto Thomas's shoulder. He stood before the half-buried door, staring at the thick shed frame, feeling his fears from the previous night turning real. He stepped back, gripped his shovel tightly, and prepared to tell the group they would have to break the door in because at this point, they had only one task left: confirm Martha Kellgren's death. But none of them knew that in just a few minutes, all those thoughts would be completely overturned. As they readied shovels to break the door, one strong scoop cracked the thick snow in front of the porch, exposing the bottom edge of the wooden door. Thomas bent down, brushed snow aside, and pushed lightly on the frame to test sturdiness. At that moment, a metallic clink against wood came from inside a small but clear sound, the latch being slid open. The whole group froze. Seconds later, the door cracked open not from their force, but from inside the cabin. Golden firelight spilled out, and on the threshold stood Martha Kellgren, alive, alert, holding a steaming cup of hot coffee. Her face showed no exhaustion, no panic, just the calm of someone who had woken from a quiet night. She looked at the snow-covered men, her gaze lingering on Thomas a bit longer, then asked in an even voice, "You came up here for me? The storm's over." Thomas couldn't answer. His mouth opened and closed, eyes fixed inside the cabin where the fire burned steady and strong, completely unlike the struggling stoves down in the valley. There was no sign the house had gone cold, no ice on walls, no lingering smoke, just a warm, dry, bright home in the midst of a disaster the whole valley was still battling. Behind Martha, part of the narrow corridor between cabin and shed was visible. Inside it, firewood was stacked neatly in rows, absolutely dry, ready to use. No snow had entered, no moisture. It was as if the storm outside had never existed. Henry Braddock, the carpenter who had mocked her at the market, stood at the back of the group. He paused at the door, looking at the shed structure, the upright boards, the precise gap between cabin and barrier. He couldn't speak. Shame was clear on his face as he realized what he had called fundamentally wrong was working perfectly. Thomas finally managed a few words. "You're all right?" Martha nodded slightly. "I'm fine." The shed kept the wind outside. The heat stayed inside. She set the coffee cup on a table by the door and continued. Slower, more deliberate. "Joel used to tell me wind takes heat away fastest. If you block the wind, the cabin won't lose heat. The airspace between the 2 walls holds steady, and the firewood layer both insulates and stays dry for burning." She pointed to the wooden corridor. "Wind can't get in here, snow can't either, so the wood stays dry, and the stove never goes out." The 6 men stood there, unsure how to react. They had prepared to carry a body down the mountain, not meet a woman holding hot coffee and explaining heat retention principles as if they were obvious. Thomas swallowed hard, eyes red from wind and something else. Henry only bowed his head, unable to meet Martha's gaze. The truth before them was too clear. While the valley struggled with wet wood, dying fires, and freezing homes, Martha Kellgren had survived actively, calculatedly, using techniques her husband left behind things no one in the area had listened to while she built the shed. And now, all the mockery stood as proof of their own ignorance. Martha stepped back inside, opening the door wider. "If you want to warm up a bit, come in. It's cold out there." No one argued. They entered the cabin, leaving behind the storm and everything they had once thought was right. News that Martha was alive spread through Frosthill Valley in just one morning. When Thomas's group returned, people dropped their tasks and flocked to the base of Raven Bluff to see for themselves what they could hardly believe. The only cabin in the entire area that had stayed warm throughout the blizzard. Groups climbed the hill one after another, wading through hip-deep snow, trying to understand with their own eyes what had happened at the place they were certain had become a snowy grave the night before. When they arrived, the sight stopped everyone in their tracks. Martha's shed stood intact, though snow covered it nearly to the roof. No signs of bending, breaking, or shifting. The entire load-bearing structure remained exactly in place, as if the storm hadn't touched it. Stepping into the corridor between shed and cabin, many touched the wall of stacked firewood. Each log was dry to the point of being lightweight, no ice clinging, no moisture, completely unlike the swollen, frozen, waterlogged piles down in the valley. They touched the cabin walls and felt the wood still warm. None of them had ever seen a cabin survive. 40 degrees Fahrenheit with walls retaining that level of heat. The news spread so fast that by the same afternoon, the Frosthill Chronicle sent a reporter up the hill for an interview. The next day's article ran the headline, "The Kellgren Insulation Technique. Wind Barrier Saves a Life in the Great White Tempest." It described in detail how Martha created a still air space between cabin and outer wood layer, how she stacked firewood vertically to optimize wind blocking, and how the sloped shed roof let snow slide away instead of pressing against the cabin. Many readers only then realized they had relied on habit more than understanding all those years. The following winter, Frosthill Valley changed completely. Those who had laughed at Martha became the first to raise posts, join roofs, and frame sheds around their own cabins. It started with a few homes near Raven Bluff, then the eastern area where wind was strongest, then the entire scattered settlement around the valley. With each completed house, they looked toward the widow's small cabin, acknowledging that for the first time in their lives, they were learning how to prepare for winter from someone they had once thought knew nothing about building. Henry Braddock came last. He stood before Martha's cabin one early winter afternoon, hat in hand, silent for a long time. Martha opened the door, looking much the same as on storm day, still calm, still upright, eyes holding no reproach. Henry took a deep breath and said, voice rough with shame, "I was wrong. I mocked what I didn't understand." Martha just looked at him, not replying immediately. Henry continued, "You were right. Your shed saved you, and now it's saving the whole valley." After another pause, Martha spoke slowly. "The wood saved me. I only did what my husband taught me." Not an exaggerated answer, not prideful, just fact. She had used what she understood to survive and unintentionally helped the valley change how it thought about winter. By season's end, looking down on Frosthill Valley from afar, one saw small cabins standing within solid wooden rings, a sight never seen before. People called it Kellgren's second winter. The winter an entire valley followed the widow they had once seen as eccentric. And for them, it was the first winter they entered not with fear, but with true preparation. 20 years passed since the Great White Tempest, and Frosthill Valley changed so much that anyone away too long would hardly recognize it. Enclosing sheds around cabins were no longer unusual, but the default structure for every home in the windy area. And on Raven Bluff itself, once considered the first death spot each winter, Martha Kellgren's cabin still stood in its original place, almost unchanged. Snow still fell each year, wind still lashed the northern slopes, but that cabin never suffered a serious incident again. Small research groups from larger towns like Windham and Copper Ridge gradually visited, recording Martha's shed structure and documents on climate-adaptive architecture. They wrote that Martha's cabin was one of the earliest examples of the double-wall still air concept in extreme cold conditions, a design no frontier textbook of the time mentioned. In local classrooms, teachers told children about the winter the valley thought a widow had died, while she alone truly understood heat retention principles. The story didn't emphasize Martha's tragedy or loneliness, but what made it unforgettable. She didn't wait for luck. she prepared. She didn't follow habit. She observed and changed. And she didn't need anyone's belief to start doing what was right. Young people growing up after the storm knew the tale by heart. They knew there was a time when valley folk mocked her, mocked because they thought she knew nothing about building. Mocked because they thought she was locking herself in a useless box. They knew that laughter stopped when the storm hit, when their stoves died, when yard firewood turned to frozen blocks, and when they had to burn furniture to stay warm. And they knew that the next morning, the calmest survivor was the one mocked the most. Martha's cabin was added to local history maps as the Kellgren insulation model, a name professors gave for classification, though locals still called it the old way. The widow's cabin. Many winters passed. The shed roof had a few timbers replaced, the cabin door latch repaired, the porch gained snow steps, but the structure's spirit remained. Focus on wind, reduce heat loss, protect vital fuel. When outsiders visited Frosthill Valley, locals often pointed up the hill and told the story as part of the area's identity. No embellishment, no myth, just a woman who refused to die from others' mistakes. On rare, clear winter days, sunlight slanted onto Raven Bluff, shining on the shed darkened by years. The small cabin stood quietly as a living record of practical frontier wisdom, wisdom not from schools but from observation, loss, and steadfast persistence. Old folks in the area often told grandchildren, "If you want to understand winter, go up the hill and look at that cabin. Just looking tells you why it endures." And in every retelling, there was always one passage kept nearly unchanged over the years, as if it were the conclusion of an entire era. That narrator's line appeared in books, winter festivals, children's tours. Not everyone mocked is wrong. Sometimes the thing mocked is what keeps us alive. It wasn't just a lesson about one widow, but about human humility before nature, and about how survival sometimes comes not from strength, but from daring to see a problem in a way no one else has thought of. If you enjoy stories of survival and forgotten frontier wisdom, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next journey.